Boston, Massachusetts, on December 14, 2016. The streets were deserted, covered in a thin layer of snow that reflected the pale glow of streetlights. The houses in the neighborhood were decorated for Christmas, with colorful lights hanging in the windows, but at the Benson family home, the atmosphere was anything but festive. The Benson house was a typical two-story building, with a simple facade and a garden that, in the summer, was carefully maintained by John Benson, the head of the family. John was a 55-year-old man, with a closed expression, known for his rigid posture and strong temperament. He was respected in the community, but at home, his daughters, Emily and Sarah, saw him very differently. Emily Benson, the youngest, was 23 years old. She was a reserved young woman, with long brown hair and a shy look. He spent most of his time in his room, where he liked to draw and read. Her older sister, 25-year-old Sarah Benson, was more outgoing, with a more assertive personality. They were inseparable, best friends and confidants since they were little, but what no one knew was that their relationship went beyond brotherhood. Since their teens, Emily and Sarah discovered that their feelings for each other were not just those of sisters. The love they felt was intense, deep, and as they grew older, this feeling blossomed into a secret relationship. Growing up under the stern gaze of John, who had a traditional and unyielding outlook on life, the sisters knew that their love would be unacceptable in his eyes. They lived for years hiding the truth, taking refuge in the moments they could spend together away from their father's watchful eyes. However, as the years passed, hiding this secret became increasingly difficult. John, always controlling, began to notice changes in his daughter's behavior. He noticed the way they looked at each other, how they were always together, and how they avoided talking to him. These observations began to fuel his suspicions, but he never imagined the depth of what was happening. On the night of December 14th, the tension in the house was almost palpable. John, suspicious, had begun to observe his daughters more closely. He could tell something was wrong, but he still couldn't understand exactly what. The sisters, in turn, were increasingly apprehensive. The fear of being discovered by their father grew every day, and they knew they couldn't hide the truth forever. Around 10 p.m., John decided it was time to confront his daughters. He walked slowly up the stairs, stopping in front of their bedroom door. Inside, Emily and Sarah were sitting on the bed, exchanging worried glances. They felt like something was about to happen, something that would change their lives forever. John took a deep breath before opening the door. Upon entering, he found his daughters side by side, in silence. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and for a brief moment, no one said anything. Then, with a deep and authoritative voice, John finally broke the silence. "What are you hiding from me?" he asked, his gaze hard and penetrating. The sisters looked at each other, and fear took over their hearts. They knew they could no longer lie, but they also knew that revealing the truth could have dire consequences. Sarah tried to respond, but her voice trailed off. Emily, more shy, lowered her head, avoiding her father's gaze. John took a step forward, approaching his daughters. Anger was beginning to bubble inside him, mixed with the anxiety of finding out what was happening. Finally, Sarah, gathering all the courage she had, raised her head and faced her father. "Father," she began, her voice shaking, "there's something we need to tell you." Before he could continue, John interrupted abruptly. I knew something was wrong." He raised his voice, his face turning red with anger. "What are you two doing? Do you think you can fool me?" The fear in Sarah's eyes intensified, but she knew there was no turning back. Emily, on the other hand, felt a mixture of dread and despair. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her sister, of losing the love they shared. Sarah started to speak, but the words caught in her throat. John took another step forward, now getting very close to his daughters. He could see the fear in their eyes, and it only increased his anger. He was about to explode, but before he could say anything else, Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but full of emotion. "We love each other, Dad." For a moment, silence filled the room. John froze, processing what he had just heard. His mind raced, trying to understand what that meant. When realization finally hit him, anger consumed him completely. "This is unacceptable," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the room. "I won't allow that in this house. You too, you are sick." John's words were like a knife in the sisters' hearts. The love they cherished so much was now being destroyed before their eyes. They knew that, from that moment on, nothing would be the same as before. John was determined to separate them, and the prospect of living without each other was unbearable. That night, the sisters were locked in their room, in silence. The fear of being separated, the pain of being rejected by their own father, and the despair of not knowing what to do. All of this was mixed together in a whirlwind of emotions. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, as if nothing had happened. But inside that house, chaos reigned. And so, on that cold December night, the Bensons' deepest secrets began to unravel, sending them into a spiral of despair that would end in unspeakable tragedy. 2 days had passed since the terrible confrontation between John Benson and his daughters, Emily and Sarah. Inside the house, the tension was almost suffocating. The silence between the family members was as heavy as the snow piled up outside. Each of the sisters now lived in constant fear that their father might at any moment take drastic action. On December 12, 2016, John was angrier than ever. He barely spoke to his daughters and spent most of his time locked in his office, making calls and typing furiously on the computer. Emily and Sarah knew he was planning something. Perhaps, they thought, he was looking for ways to legally separate them, or even try to send them away from home. The psychological tension was devastating for both of them. John's behavior had not gone unnoticed by his sisters. He watched them more closely, like a hunter waiting for the right moment to attack. The windows of the house seemed like eyes that were always open, watchful, and even the walls seemed to conspire against them. Nowhere was safer. Emily and Sarah avoided being alone with their father, but the small space in the house made this task impossible. Every interaction was filled with suspicious looks and cutting words, especially from John. On the morning of December 12th, Sarah noticed something was different. John had left for a meeting downtown, but before he went, he left a note on the kitchen table. The note, written in firm, aggressive handwriting, simply said, "Resolve this situation, otherwise, I'll resolve it for you." The note was a clear threat. John was making it clear that he would no longer tolerate what was happening. He would not accept the relationship between his daughters continuing, and his patience had run out. Sarah read the note with a lump in her throat and immediately showed it to Emily. They both knew time was running out. The pressure increased, and the feeling of being trapped became more intense by the minute. That night brought with it more than just darkness. John returned home late, drunk and red-faced with anger. He barely looked at his daughters, but the contempt in his eyes spoke more than 1,000 words. Sitting at the kitchen table, he began to drink silently. Emily and Sarah watched him from a distance, fearing what might happen. The sound of the ice hitting the glass in John's glass echoed through the house, louder and louder in their already fragile minds. At around 11 p.m., John, already visibly impaired by alcohol, decided it was time to confront his daughters again. He got up from the table with suppressed aggression and went up the stairs, staggering slightly but determined. In the sisters' room, Emily and Sarah were sitting on the bed, trying to remain calm, but they knew they could no longer avoid confrontation. John invaded the room without knocking on the door, like a hurricane, launching himself at them with uncontained rage. He demanded answers, demanded that they explain themselves in a way he could understand. But deep down, John didn't want explanations. He wanted control. He wanted everything to go back to the way it was before. He wanted his daughters to be what he considered normal. "I already warned you. This will end now," John shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "I will not allow this type of perversion in my house." Sarah, her heart racing, tried to argue, but her words didn't make sense to John. For him, this was an illness, something that needed to be corrected at any cost. We can't change who we are, Dad," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible, trying to maintain her composure. John didn't listen. He was blinded by anger. He advanced towards Emily, grabbing her arm tightly. Emily tried to free herself, but her father's strength was greater than hers. Sarah, seeing her sister in danger, panicked. She ran to her father, trying to pull him away from Emily, but John, already out of his mind, violently pushed her against the wall. The impact was so strong that Sarah fell to the ground, stunned. Emily, seeing her sister fallen, screamed in despair. She had never seen her father act with such brutality. Things had gone too far. The sisters knew that if they didn't do something quickly, it could end in tragedy. John was clearly willing to take more drastic action to impose his will. After a few tense moments, John finally backed away. Maybe it was the effect of the alcohol, or maybe he knew he had crossed a dangerous line. He left the room without saying anything else, leaving the sisters alone, shaken and afraid. For the next 2 days, Emily and Sarah barely left their room. The atmosphere in the house was heavier than ever. The constant fear that John could do something even worse tormented them. Despair grew within them, fueled by the fear of being separated and the terror of the violence they witnessed. They began to think about possibilities, to question what would become of their lives from now on. The only thing they knew for sure was that they couldn't continue living like that. Their father, once just a rigid, controlling figure, had now become a real danger. The winter that year was relentless. Snow piled up on the streets of Buffalo, New York, covering the world outside in a blanket of white, while inside the Benson home, the mood was completely different. It was dark, suffocating, and everyone seemed to be living on a knife's edge, about to break. Since their last confrontation with their father, Emily and Sarah have been on the verge of a breakdown. The days passed slowly, like a silent countdown to something inevitable. On December 14th, 2016, everything changed. The clock showed 10:45 p.m., and the tension was palpable. John had come home from work early, visibly angry, but this time, he was sober, which made everything even scarier. Emily and Sarah were in the room, talking in whispers about what they were going to do. They knew that staying in that house was impossible, but where to go? They had nowhere to run. The outside world did not accept them, and the man who was supposed to protect them was the greatest danger they faced. Emily knew what her sister was implying. The thought of taking their own father's life was horrifying, something they would never have considered under any other circumstances. But now, after months of emotional and physical abuse, with the constant fear of being separated and destroyed by him, it seemed like the only way to break free. Sarah was determined. She knew it was risky. She knew there was no guarantee they would get away with it, but at the same time, she felt like she had nothing left to lose. John had turned their lives into a nightmare. For Sarah, this was a matter of survival. Emily was still reluctant, but she knew Sarah was right. They had no other option. The fear of continuing to live in that hell was greater than any other fear. They decided, then, that night everything would end. At around 11:30 p.m., John went upstairs, staggering a little from the alcohol. He opened the door to his daughter's room with force, as if he wanted to intimidate them from the first moment. His face was flushed, his eyes were half closed in hatred, and his hands were shaking with anger. "What are you doing here? Still locked in that room like cowards?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. Emily and Sarah were standing ready but silent. The moment had arrived. John took a few more steps into the room, his gaze alternating between the two. He seemed on the verge of a breakdown, furious at what he considered a betrayal within his own home. Sarah moved quickly, before her father could react. With a decisive movement, she picked up a heavy lamp that was on the bedside table and, without hesitation, swung it at John's head. The impact was brutal. John staggered back, disoriented and surprised, but still conscious. Emily, without thinking twice, ran to help her sister, grabbing anything she could use as a weapon. He found a kitchen knife that they had hidden days before, anticipating that they might need to defend themselves. John tried to get up, but before he could make any move, Emily rushed forward. She plunged the knife into her father's chest with a scream of pure adrenaline and desperation. The shock in John's eyes was undeniable, but his body, weak from the previous blow, gave way. He fell to the ground, coughing up blood, as his sisters watched him, transfixed by what they had just done. Time seemed to slow down. Emily and Sarah stood there, looking at their father's body, their breathing quick and uneven. John tried to say something, but his voice wouldn't come out. His eyes, once filled with anger, were now filled with fear and surprise. In a matter of minutes, he stopped moving. The silence in the house was overwhelming. The sisters remained motionless for a long time, until Sarah finally broke the silence. It's done. They knew their lives would change forever, but in that moment, the fear and terror were gone. The man who kept them prisoner in his own home was no longer there. However, a new nightmare was about to begin. What would they do with the body? And how would they keep this secret buried? The next decision they would make would define their fate forever. The silence that took over the Benson home was almost deafening. The clock on the living room wall showed 0:15 on December 15th, 2016, and John's body lay motionless on the bedroom floor. The lights, which had previously illuminated the room softly, now seemed to shine brighter, exposing the horrible reality with terrifying clarity. Emily and Sarah stood there, staring at what they had done, still in shock. Their hearts were beating out of control, and their thoughts were a complete mess. Nothing had prepared them for that moment. As much as the terror of living under John's control was over, the new reality was even scarier. They had taken a life, the life of their own father. Now they needed to decide what they would do next. Sarah, the more resolute of the two, who had led the plan thus far, was struggling to maintain control. She knew there was no going back, but the real question was, how to keep this a secret? How to escape a life of arrests, interrogations, and trials? "We need to get rid of the body," Sarah said, her voice shaky but determined. Emily nodded slowly, even though she was shaking from head to toe. They knew that time was crucial. Soon, people would notice John's disappearance, and questions would begin to arise. They needed to act quickly, but intelligently. Any mistake could land them straight in jail. The improvised plan was as simple as it was desperate. Sarah suggested that they use the family car to transport John's body to a remote location where they could bury him without leaving a trace. They waited until late at night, when all the lights in the neighboring houses were off, and carefully rolled the body into a large rug in the hallway. The weight of the dead body was greater than they expected, making transporting it to the car an almost impossible task. They dragged John to the garage, trying not to make any noise, but the constant fear of being seen or heard made every sound a nightmare. The snow-covered streets of Buffalo were deserted at that hour, and the sisters took advantage of this to put their plan into practice. They drove for hours, heading south, away from the city. None of them spoke. The silence in the car was dense, almost suffocating. The lights of the road passed over their faces, revealing the expression of fear and guilt they both wore. Sarah drove, focused on the road ahead, while Emily stared out the window, trying to process what they had just done. At around 3 a.m., they arrived at a remote forest where they knew it was unlikely anyone would pass by. With great effort, they dragged the body to an isolated area and began to dig. The work was slow, tiring, and the snow made things even more difficult. Sarah and Emily could barely feel their hands due to the cold, but they didn't stop until the grave was deep enough. After depositing John's body in the makeshift grave, the sisters covered it with dirt and snow, trying to erase any sign that anyone had been there. When they were done, they stood there, looking at the grave, trying to process what they had done. The feeling of relief they expected to feel never came. Instead, everything seemed darker. They were free from John, but trapped by a secret that would consume them for the rest of their lives. "No one will ever know," Sarah murmured, trying to convince both herself and Emily. Emily, however, said nothing. She knew that no matter how much they hid the body and buried the past, her father's ghost would always be with them. Guilt, fear, and paranoia soon began to eat away at both of them, making it impossible to lead a normal life. In the following days, they tried to continue their routines. They invented a story that John had gone on a business trip and wouldn't be back for a while. They tried to keep up appearances, but John's disappearance soon began to raise suspicions. Friends and co-workers noticed his absence and began asking questions. The police were involved. During the following weeks, the sisters lived in constant fear of being discovered. Every knock on the door made their hearts race. They knew that John's disappearance would not go unnoticed for long, but still, they maintained the facade, trying to hide their growing panic. Then, On a cold morning in January 2017, the inevitable happened. Authorities showed up at the Bensons' door with a search warrant. They had followed leads that indicated the possibility of something much darker behind John's disappearance. Investigations revealed small inconsistencies in the sisters' stories, and eventually the truth came out. John's body was found after an anonymous tip pointing to the isolated area of the forest. The evidence, combined with the pressure of the investigation, ended up forcing Emily to confess. Under intense interrogation, she revealed everything, unable to bear the weight of the secret she was carrying any longer. Sarah tried to resist, but ended up giving in too. The two were arrested, and the ensuing trial attracted national attention. The case was described as one of the most bizarre and tragic the city of Buffalo had ever seen. The secret love between the sisters and the unbearable tension within the Benson household resulted in a shocking crime. During the trial, disturbing details came to light, revealing a home torn apart by abuse and fear. In the end, both were condemned, but their story became a symbol of the horror that can arise when love is oppressed and secrets are kept in the shadows for too long. For Sarah and Emily, the story's end was bitter and cruel, a reminder that even the strongest bonds can be destroyed by the darkness in the human heart. Now, the sisters spend their days behind bars, separated by the fate of their own making, living with the weight of what they did forever.